everybody, this is Carter, and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the conversation series where I get a chit chat with other writers, and we get to make up a short story at the end, which is always, boy, I've done this almost 150 times. I'm always a little bit freaked out right before we start, and then I usually get into a groove pretty quickly, but sometimes it's scarier than other times. This time it was actually fantastic, and I'm going to get to my guest in just a second, but just a reminder that my company, Unbound Writer, is now taking registrations for my October 2024 immersive coaching program and writing retreat here in beautiful Boulder, Colorado. So please come join us for 2.5 days of community, finding confidence, and recommitting to your writing goals. It's a fantastic program. I will say I love doing it. I love helping writers kind of get through some of the mental blocks that they're having. We talk a lot about writing psychology, where there's actually time to write as well, but there's a decent amount of instruction. And there is a lot of instruction about how to write, even though I'm a firm believer that there's a million different ways to write a book. But I show you my way, how I do it, and that might help you as well. But it's open to any types of writers, regardless of genre, fiction, nonfiction. So check it out. You can look at everything at unboundwriter.com. So today on the guest, I had a fantastic guest. I had today on the show, I should say, I had a fantastic guest. I had Mary Bly, who writes under the name Eloisa James. So she's a New York Times bestselling romance author of many, 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 many novels. And her new book, which is out now, just came out on July 23rd, is Viscount in Love. And I just had such a fun conversation with her. First of all, she lives part of the year in Florence, Italy, where her husband's from. So I was speaking to her in Italy. And so that was kind of just, it was nice to see an author kind of living that dream of like, oh, I'll spend the summer in Italy. But it was just so interesting hearing about, her first attempts at writing. And first of all, her father is a very well-known poet, American Book Award winner, Robert Bly. Who she related the story that Taylor Swift just came out with a song that referenced her father. So that was probably a more widely known thing than him winning the American Book Award, which is one of the greatest honors you can have. So she started writing and publishing, I think, in the 80s and 90s, and first attempt was a mystery novel, which she just couldn't, figure out. It wasn't kind of her thing. And then she started writing romance, and then she had pretty much immediate success. Her first book went to auction as a 3-book series, which is amazing. And she was able to pay off her student loans with that. But we went into it deep in terms of just trying to understand, the romance writing community, how it's changed over time. Just again, the idea of genre in particular. What does that even mean? What are the rules? What do you have to think about when you're writing? She's obviously had tremendous success writing as a romance author, most of it historical fiction. So the idea of having to balance out, actual historical events or be true to historical moments in time, while also being sensitive to the readership of today and how to balance those two and where you can take liberties and whatnot. So it was really fascinating. And then at the end, we made up kind of a romance story. You'll have to judge for yourself. But Mary was fantastic. Again, she writes as Eloisa James. You're going to like this one. This is my conversation with Mary Bly. I was reflecting upon your name earlier because the name Bly, I just had a character. I just released a book where the character's name is Penny Bly. And she was inspired by Nellie Bly, who was a journalist back in like the 20s and 30s. And I was always fascinated by the character Nellie Bly. So I have no idea if there's any relationship there with you or not.
Alas, no. We were Blyas until my great-grandfather came to Ellis Island.
Okay.
From Norway, it was too difficult to spell. So
yeah, the traditional shortening and changing of the name at Ellis Island. Okay.
Yep.
because Nellie Bly is quite inspirational in terms of it. And one of the main things she did was she couldn't get a job as a journalist because no one wanted to hire a woman. And so she finally got a job with Pulitzer, who ran, I think, New York Magazine. And he sent her undercover into an insane asylum to pretend that she was, a lunatic to report on the deplorable conditions within. And it was this amazing story. She spent 10 days in there and she became worldwide known after that. So I always thought that was pretty cool. But of course, you don't write under that name. You write under the name Eloisa. How did you come up with it? What was the inspiration for that?
Well, I was a junior professor, right? So I couldn't publish under my own name because I thought I'll never get tenure. And we were actually, my husband is Italian. We were going by a lamppost and it said, Chiama Eloisa, basically lose 20 pounds in 20 days. I was like, oh, that'd be a great name for our unborn child. And he was like, no, that is nouveau riche. You may not. And I was like, I'll take it.
That's a
So
fantastic story.
yeah, I knew nothing about being an author, which you don't. And so I chose Eloisa, which was very helpful because I'm the only Eloisa in romance. And then James, because Alcester happened to be reading Henry James, which gave me a very short name,
Right.
which would show above the centerfold in Walmart and various drugstores, etc. So
But of course, you probably didn't have any of those thoughts in mind at the time.
no,
You
I
have
had
no
no idea
idea.
at all. None. They wrote me and they were like, can you give us the name that you're going to copyright it by tonight? I was like, oh, wow.
So that
Okay.
was with your first book that all this kind of came together. Um, I'm curious a little bit about the thought process behind, like, oh, if I publish, and I don't know if it's because you're publishing romance or whatever it is, under my name as a junior professor, I won't get tenure. What was the kind of the thought process behind that?
Well, there are two things, right? One is that romance is a highly denigrated genre within academia and in
Hmm.
culture at large, less so perhaps in the last 10 years, but this was 1999, right? My first book came out in 2000. And the second was professors do an enormous amount of administrative work. I'm just finishing up 5 years as chair of English of, Fordham University. And I have to see if a junior colleague of mine said, hey, I'm signing a 3-book contract and you're doing all this great stuff. I would think she's not going to pull her share, right? She's going to
Yeah.
be a prima donna. So I waited until I had hit the New York Times list. And also I was already director of graduate studies. So
Okay.
that when I tell my department, it was like, hey, I'm not just, writing like some little thing that your grandmother wrote. It's in the New York Times list. And by the way, I'm still DGS. So
That's fantastic. I mean, do you find, and so I don't know a lot about my agent actually reps a decent amount of romance, so I know some. But within the romance writing community, is it more common than not to write under a pseudonym?
it's hard to tell.
Yeah.
Like I don't always know.
Right.
I answer to Eloisa and Mary if I'm at a conference. I don't really care. Um, I think less so now, but when I started, for sure, there were a lot of pseudonyms.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It's
you
interesting, and there's a lot of reasons why people choose that, or even throughout their professional career they might change over to, because if your sales are sluggish, then change your name, kind of a fresh start, which is always a weird, scary thing. But it is also, I totally understand the idea of being in a professional workplace and being worried that people think that you're not giving it your all because you're doing something else, which is kind of a little weird when you think about it, because if you could go home at night and watch 2 hours of Netflix and nobody would say anything every night. But if you wrote for 2 hours and say you're really pursuing this as something more than just a hobby, they would think that you're slacking from your work. But
It's also got to do with the genre, though, because think about it. I have several colleagues who write novels, and that's absolutely acceptable. But, I'll just quote my own mother. She said, oh, well, I don't read that sex stuff. And if you're writing books that have sex in them, you're writing romance as required by contemporary readers, that makes people uneasy. And that a lot of misogyny goes into
yeah.
to the denigration of that genre, I would say. So it's
Yeah.
a double-headed sword there because academics tend to be very conservative.
Oh,
I'm
interesting.
a Shakespeare professor, so
Right.
I have the high and the low.
Right. Right. But it's also the human condition. I don't know. We've had a lot of conversations on this podcast about the definitions of genres, or the very watery and loose definitions of genre.
Yeah.
And, you can write something that's emotional, that has romance, that has sex,
Right.
and is still qualified as a thriller, for example.
Yeah.
Who knows? Who knows what it is? Do you, so let's back up a little bit. Growing up, where are you from originally? I know you're in Italy right now because your husband's
Yeah.
Italian, and like the dream of all authors, you summer in Italy.
Yeah. Oh, I'm very lucky.
Which sounds great. Um, where are you from originally?
I'm from Minnesota. I
Okay.
grew up on a farm in Minnesota. My father's a poet, Robert Bly.
Oh,
Was
okay.
so I grew up on a farm that had a million books and no TVs, and literature was the main focus of both my parents. And I
Well,
will say, my dad has been famous for winning the American Book Award, but I'm very proud to say that 2 weeks ago, Taylor Swift included his name in one of her songs, and now he's famous for a whole nother reason. Robert
that's
Bly on your bedside table. Woo!
that's amazing. How did you
Yeah.
find out that happened?
My email, everything lit
Just
up the
blew
morning
up.
after the song dropped. Yeah, she co-wrote it with someone else, and it dropped. And there's that one line, and then part of it is named after one of his poems. And I woke up the next morning because I'm always 7 hours ahead, and I was like, "What happened?" And
That's
that's what happened.
that's amazing. I mean, that's funny that's the American Book Award. Sure, that's great, but Taylor Swift.
Taylor Swift, forget that's everything.
So it seems like I could see the through line between your upbringing and wanting to go into the creative arts, particularly literature. What was that? Was that a focus as you started thinking about secondary education, that you wanted to study that, or was your father the poet saying, even with all my success, it's a tough field?
No, no, I became a Shakespeare professor, so
Yeah.
that's what I was going to do. But I needed to make money because we had one child, and I had student loans. My husband, as I said, is from Italy, and they don't have student loans in Italy. So he
Right.
was appalled by the debt I had. So I was like, that's fine. When my dad wanted money, he would write a book, and HarperCollins would send him in advance. And weirdly, I've been with HarperCollins for almost 25 years. And if I want money, they send me in advance.
Wow. Yeah.
I decided I would write a book, and I tried a mystery, couldn't do it. But I always loved a romance. And so I tried a romance, and it went up for auction. It was a few $1,000s over my student loans, but I had to write 3 books for that.
But
So
that's
that just
amazing.
started a career.
That doesn't happen. Like that's really cool. Like I mean, as I always say, my first 3 books didn't sell, but they were learning. And I'm like, I got an agent with my first one, but you're teaching yourself, and you're like, all right, if you can dedicate yourself to the rejection and to learn from it, it can steer you in the right direction. But to have a three
I
book
should say I
deal,
have one dead one as well.
yeah,
I think we all have a dead book under our bed, or 3. Maybe you've rewritten them now, but I mean, I don't know that I could rewrite mine. It was called Passion's Slave. It was terrible. You can't even
wow.
use the word slave anymore. It'd have to be Passion's enslaved woman or something.
So
But
this
yeah,
wasn't the mystery. The mystery never even got done.
no, the mystery never made it past, the death of
The dead
my
body on the
murder
floor.
was, yeah, somebody shot arsenic into a tube of toothpaste. I mean, I couldn't stop just taking the piss out of it. So
Yeah, right. That's fantastic. Um, so when in your career as a Shakespeare professor did you start attempting to write a book?
well, I wrote that first book after I graduated from college.
Okay.
I already had that idea, but well, I can tell you the whole saga. I had a boyfriend at that point who was an investment banker, and he had
Hmm.
an assistant of his own. So he gave her the book, which was about 600 pages, and
Oh,
said, Xerox this and send it to publishers. So she did. She sent it to everyone, and it was rejected by everyone. And my favorite rejection letters from the Sierra Club. They said it was very frisky, but it wasn't in their line. And I just gave up, and
The
I,
Sierra Club. That's
yeah,
fantastic. They're like,
you
where are
really
the
did
animals?
it. Yeah. So I went off to Oxford to get an MPhil, and my mother was a great conservationist. She was saving all the books when they came back and using them to write her own work on the back of them. And a letter came from Harlequin saying, "Hey, we really like this. If you want to edit it down to about 200 pages, we can totally consider writing it." And I couldn't. I was deep into my MPhil. Then came back to the US for a PhD, but I always remembered that they had faith that I could do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
When I need money, I went for it.
Well, that's amazing because the idea of a publisher receiving an unagented 600-page romance novel, I think most of that would be, we're not even going to look at this. Like, it's not even, so to have Harlequin actually read the whole thing and say, we can do this, that's a pretty big shot of confidence. Because yeah, romance, so word count and romance is, I think, my limited knowledge, typically skew a little bit like 70 to 80,000. Is that probably correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
85 to 90 sometimes for the longer ones. But you got to remember, this is, 1999. Well, and even earlier when I wrote that first one, so that would have been 1986. So the big blockbuster romances are number one, number two on the Times for weeks and weeks and weeks. And they're looking for people who can write them. Right when I was doing that, I was just a little bit late. But yeah, they were looking because
Yeah.
it was top of the market at that point.
Right. The
And those
timing was
are
great.
cute. The Flame and the Flower. And I mean, I'm later than those, but still, those books are very large.
Yeah. And it seems like I mean, again, from my limited perspective, it seems like it's only grown. Every time I talk to or hear about romance writers, I feel like, geez, that's where the money is. That's, there's a massive readership that's not only enormous, it's very dedicated and committed. I know that also then begets stories of infighting, and there's always seems to be drama around, like I hear stuff around romance conventions, like somebody stole somebody's work or something else happened. But it's such a passionate community, it seems. So I assume for you, coming through with this 3-book deal early in your career, you start grabbing fans who just have stayed with you.
Yeah, I mean, there was huge drama, right? Enormous drama, because I got a hardcover deal and other people had been writing for a long time and weren't in hardcover. And also, I didn't know anything about writing. I mean, anything about writing. I never took a creative writing class. So
Right, me neither.
everybody had a point of view. The butler would come in and have a point of view.
There's 20 points of view all within one chapter.
It didn't matter. Everybody had a point of view. And I remember they were putting out such mean reviews on Amazon, which was in its infancy then, and I would read them and cry, and they were always talking about POV, and I was like, what is POV? I had no idea what they're talking about. And that's point of view. So yeah, there was lots of drama. I had lots of inaccuracies in there because I didn't know that romance readers were I'm a Shakespearean. I thought I'm very accurate when it comes to my scholarship. With this is fantasy.
Right.
This is not writing a historical novel. But then I realized for historical romance, there's a very uneven balance you have to do between the amount of historical knowledge they want and the amount of fantasy they want.
Yeah.
And they do want the historical knowledge. So I figured out what they wanted and have had a very long career doing it.
But you still, and when we talk about reviews and things like that, because that's always a kryptonite for every writer, is just kind of peeking to see what people are saying. No matter what, you still sold the book. You didn't self-publish the book. You have a professional house and editor who accepted everything, accepted those 20 points of view, because even though maybe that goes against convention, it worked, then that's kind of the main thing. Does it work or doesn't it work? That is interesting about the historical aspects, though. Is that a reflection of, when people are reading, they want to obviously put themselves in those character shoes, and they want to have the empathy, and they want to experience those same moments. Is it, if you don't have the historical accuracy correct, then it pulls them away from that ability to empathize with the characters, or is it just like their pet peeve?
Well, you're creating a fantasy world, right? In which we don't have the divisions that we have now. We don't have the politics. We don't have problems. All of my characters are rich because, as I said, I grew up on a farm, the daughter of a poet.
Right.
Like
That's your
poverty does
fantasy.
not interest me. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that they want both. And I find that the most successful historical romances, the a historical fact is at the heart of it. So, for example, I have this book coming out, Viscount in Love, and it came from the moment when one of my advisees was diagnosed, or I'm not sure that's really, was told he was dyslexic. And I
Mm,
had no idea. I mean, I taught him, and I thought he was a terrible speller, but so am
right.
I, so
Right.
whatever.
Right. Right.
I was like, why don't you spell check? Anyway, turned out he was dyslexic. And that made me think in, 1705, 1805,
There's no telling somebody that.
yeah, you're dyslexic, right? But everyone just thinks you're an idiot because you
Right.
can't learn to read and you can't learn to write. So my heroine in Viscount in Love has basically been dismissed by society as an idiot. She's a ninny. She can't read, she can't write. She can actually only write in blue ink, which is an interesting detail I learned about dyslexic people.
Hmm.
Some of them can write in blue, but not in black, or in a different color, but not in black.
I've
So
never heard that. That's
that
fascinating.
historical, yeah, that historical moment then triggers the plot in which my Viscount doesn't want to marry a woman who can't read in French, let alone can't read in English. This is not
Hmm.
what he wants for his wife and for his children, but he has to get married and he ends up married to her. And in fact, I people always think that romance is about love, and it is. But I mean, at the base, for me, it's about comeuppance very often. It's about the
Oh,
fact at the end, he's like, oh, okay, she's one of the smartest women I know.
right.
And all of us are going, yes,
Right.
yes.
It's the
Just
pretty
like
woman scene
that.
where she walks back into the store
Yeah.
with all the
Yeah.
money.
Yeah. And she does.
Right. That
It's a
that's
great
awesome.
moment. So I think
So you're starting your career and you're probably amazed that not only are they giving you enough money to cover your student loans, but they're asking for 3 books. So then you have to be thinking, I guess I'm a romance writer at this point, because it's still at that point, you're still kind of feels like kind of could be anyway, any theme, you're still finding your footing and it's not mystery, and romance work, but now you're committed to 3. Was there a thought process about like, I guess this is what I'll just do for the rest of my life now? Or are there moments where you're like, I want to write different things under different names?
Well, no, I mean, so I'm a professor at the same time, right?
Right,
I get my
right.
first job at Washington University in St. Louis, and the first book came out in hardcover. I walked into the library and they had a pop fiction section, and my book was face out, and they had switched the photograph on the back, reversed it, and they said no one will recognize you, and no one ever did. So no, I thought, okay, I had to write all 3 in order to get the advance to pay off my student loans, right?
Right, 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 right.
So I thought I'll write these 3. But by the end of the 3, I really loved it. And I had this sense that I was good at it. I was learning all the time. And I think being good, I'm sure you agree, as a writer, like you learn one thing and there's always something else and something else and something else. Whereas academia, I was really, really interested in my first book. And then I felt like I kind of said everything I had to say there. And I moved into sort of being director of grad studies and then chair and so on. So, but that's not to say that I didn't write under my own name, because one of the last things my mother said to me was, you're going to write a real book in 5 years. So that's it. Write romance, you're constantly like, oh, you're going to write a real book. When are you going to write a real book?
Oh
I
my God.
remember
Yeah.
one of the vice presidents, I think he was a vice publisher of HarperCollins, coming up to me at a cocktail party going, so when are you going to write a real book? I was like,
Uh,
whoa, I'm sitting at your New York Times table and you're asking me that?
right.
But anyway, so I wrote a book called Lizzie and Dante, which is about a Shakespeare professor, and it's a love story, and it's published as Mary Bly.
Okay.
Um, and that was my gift from my mother. It took me 4 years to write. It's much harder to write a contemporary novel than it is for me to write a romance, because I know where I am with romance and novels. Have you tried to write like sort of a novel?
I haven't written anything outside of psychological thriller. I wrote one YA. I co-wrote a YA. But yeah, so I feel similar to you a little bit. You know, my 10th is coming out, and they're all different. They're no series or anything like that, but they're all kind of thematically the same. They're very emotional. They're small stories about horrible things that happen to people, and how they get through it. But it could be classified as anything. It's funny when I get to like, I very, very, very infrequently write sex scenes. Because one, I'm not sure if I'm good at it, but two, I just want, like violence, I want it to be exceptionally meaningful. Like it's not just there. It's really got to propel the story, which it has to in romance also. Because you're not just writing this for the sake of people's expectations of a sex scene. And sometimes I find like, I can't write it. When I try to write the scene, I'm like, I don't see how this is really propelling the story forward. So sometimes I'll cut it out, or when I do it, it's got to really have a lot of meaning. And the same thing with violence. I don't like a lot of violence in my books, but when it happens, it's got to be a gut punch because you're not used to it. You're not seeing it all the time. But I agree with you. I think, it sounds like the way you're describing to me writing your books, and you're learning all the time, it is kind of just like finding your voice over time. And that only comes through practice. Like to me, finding your voice is synonymous with finding the POV that works the most organically for you. And for me, that happened to be first person present tense and from a female perspective, actually. And that didn't happen until my fourth book. And I'm like, why is this so easy to write? I'm like, I just flowed with it. Did you feel like you got to that place writing your novels it sounds like it kind of came to you pretty naturally early on with your first book, and you had this recognition that you were good at it. Do you feel like you just found your voice very early on?
I think I found my voice, but I guess I would play devil's advocate with you and say, okay, so you find your voice, but there's so much to learn after finding your voice.
Totally.
For one thing, in romance, and I don't know if this is true with psychological thriller so much because I'm writing historical romance. I always have to find something that is echoing what's happening now that was happening in the past. And I have to make them speak to each other. At the same time, I have an incredibly diverse audience. So I have a lot of people who have advanced degrees, and I have a lot of people who don't. So you're writing on kind of many different levels. I don't have a cohesive readership. And so over time, I've learned more and more how to figure out, okay, so I need witty dialogue. I need high emotion, right? I need that sense of comeuppance. I need historical detail, but not so much that I'm doing an information dump. Balancing all those things has taken me a long time. And I think another huge thing with romance is that it echoes what's going on, in intimate life in America, which means that I can never settle, right?
Right.
Just think of what's happened with consent in the last 10 years. I remember, I don't know if this was like 12 years ago, I was writing a great scene. This woman got kidnapped at the door of she had her own business and he was kidnapping her. And I was like, oh my God, he was just taking her to the country to meet his children, but that he can't kidnap her, So I wrote this ridiculous scene in a carriage when she's like, wait a second, there's, whatever, some things she recognized. We're not going to my home. And he said, no, well, I'm kidnapping you, for the weekend, if you wouldn't mind. And that was the beginning of consent. I don't know when that was. I don't know when it was 12, 10 years ago or whatever. But you constantly have to be listening to finding out what's happening between men and women, because that's the kind of romance I write now, because otherwise the book is going to be rejected because it won't feel right in that essential place.
It won't be relatable enough. Is that kind of the point you're getting?
It'll be offensive.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah, it'll be offensive. It'll be, the guy will be, because it's got much tougher, right? You used to be able to just have, an alpha guy. Yay, he's an alpha. Now he's got to be an alpha because that is part of the sort of cohesive dream. But he's at the same time, he's got to be totally respectful and consenting and and still an alpha.
Yeah.
So I've moved from sort of what I would call an aggressive alpha to much more of a protective alpha. He's very protective. Like if someone, put a hand on her, he'd kill him.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
But do you feel that there's that's fascinating to me. And I think you run into that in all ranges of fiction. So for example, if I wrote a story now, so sometimes I write stories that are set, say, like in the 80s, and there might be a slur that's used, which would have been totally
Wrong.
common in that
Right.
time. But today, it's like, even though it's of that era, it's still people bristle at it. So I just like, okay, I'm not going to, this is not the hill I'm going to die on. This is very easy. I agree. It's easy to change. But I was being accurate to the experiences of people from my own memory. Um,
Yeah.
how does that sit with you in terms of like, well, especially when you're going back hundreds of years, like these type of men didn't really exist back then. So why am I and I could be totally wrong about that, but do you have that balance that you're trying to make of like, it's got to be a believable character of the era, because you don't want a review saying like no person would have been this respectful back then. And I'm sure that's not accurate at all, but there is a
You don't
balance.
want that. I see exactly what you're saying. I mean, so in my first book, I didn't know nothing, right? So I was
Right.
just all huge, huge emotion. And there's
Right.
enormous, it's called Potent Pleasures. And sadly, it's still some people's favorite book that I've written. But I mean, I was just like pouring it onto the page. And at one point, the hero is convinced that his wife has been unfaithful to him, and he calls her whore. And that was absolutely, at the time, he actually would have had the right to kill her. He would have got off as a lord,
Hmm.
because she had been unfaithful, right? That the evidence was that she had been unfaithful. And so even at that time, people were like, no, he's too mean. And so with that first book, I began to realize that you can't be too historically accurate. Exactly what you're talking about. Like, I can't say, I get a letter saying, you use the word suburbs. I am never going to read your books again. And I can write back to them. And I can, put poetry, get thee into the suburbs of my affection. Oh, they won't write me back,
Right.
they're like, whatever. But you learn to kind of pick and choose those words. You just can't be too accurate. I mean, I'm not when I face the reproach of academics, I say this is, I write fantasy. I write a experience you can step into, but it's no more accurate than Bridgerton is, right? It's
Right.
not accurate.
Right.
And so,
Right. But
no.
Bridgerton number one, totally consumed. People love it. Um,
And
yeah.
Bridgerton #3 has got the highest viewing ratings of anything on Netflix this year.
Oh my
So
goodness. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I've heard about inaccuracies, but then, yeah, again, right. It's finding that balance. And
Yeah.
all the while, because you've enumerated several different things you're thinking about as you're writing, all these things that you have to balance, all these considerations, all kind of the check boxes you have to tick off, but you still have to kind of write out of your own sense of joy and for yourself and tell the story you want to tell. And that is a balance, because I've faced the same thing. And my first draft is like, this is my story. And then the second draft is like, all right, now I start hearing my agent in my head. Now I start hearing my editor in my head. And I know where the problems are, but I wouldn't get through that first draft if I didn't do it from a place of just sheer joy and wanting to find out what happens.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I mean, one of the worst things that ever happened to me was because I just write the book, and then my editor was like, "Look, Mary, this begins on page 148, right?" It's like, no, no,
I
I
would
don't
have
know.
labeled that page one if I knew that.
Ugh, that was a terrible moment. So yeah, you learn. Okay, I wrote all this part. Now I'm going to cut it before she sees it, because I know I have to write myself to the place where the story actually begins.
And it's
So
hard to have that perspective sometimes because you are alone. It's all in your head, and you lose halfway through, you lose all context of like, I
it's
don't,
all brilliant,
yeah,
right? It's
yeah.
brilliant. You're turning in this thing for the first time. Your editor and agent are going to say, "Oh, this is every word is gold." Yeah,
Wow. Yeah. I
no.
always have the sense when I'm done that it's just the worst thing I've ever written and I hate it. And
Oh,
I start getting excited about the next thing. And then
oh,
and then you have to go through all the edits and stuff like that. And you realize it's not as bad as you thought, but it's always going to need work, and you need
oh,
other
put on a
people.
reverse.
Yeah.
I always think this is great, and then I get the edits. I'm like, oh, this is utter crap.
Yeah. It never, it's, it gets easier to physically write, to flow, but the actual process of writing, finishing the book, going through the edits, it's never just like, all right, they accepted it. Now they're printing it and they added 3 commas and that was it.
No, no. And I think people don't understand that. I mean, I imagine you have a lot of people listening to your podcast who want to be writers. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I always say that my greatest advice is to recognize that you're going to write utter crap and just let yourself do it.
Right. Right. Because you don't get it done if people just want to be perfect. And once you accept the fact that it's never going to be perfect, it becomes much easier. And you kind of mentioned like almost embarrassment about your first book is still some of your fans' favorites. But you go, because I never go back and look at anything old.
Never.
But you realize that's all a reflection of who you were at that moment in your life. It's nice. It's a cool little timestamp, warts and all. And it's just like everything else. It's like, yeah, I totally remember writing that scene because my daughter was 3 at the time and the same thing happened to me. And maybe I don't like the writing, but that's kind of nice that it's almost like a little marker in my life that I can go back and look at if I ever wanted.
No, I'm exactly with you. I mean, I wrote my children into lots of the books. So my daughter had erectile vomiting. I wrote that into a book. She caught Lyme's disease twice.
Oh my goodness.
A dying child with rat bite fever, who of course didn't die, but romance has got to have your deepest fear as well as your most, your belief in love. If it doesn't have fear, just love in itself, it's very boring, right?
Right. Right. You need that tension. You need that counterbalance. And I think all books need it's that innate sense of conflict that has to be ever pervasive, and so that's like sometimes you're reading like a beautiful book, beautifully written, quote unquote, literary fiction. And you're like, nothing's happening. And I'm enjoying the experience. I love the writing, but they're just sitting around talking all day.
I know.
And there's no
literary fiction with a genre sensibility.
Right.
I'm like, I'm here for you. Right. I love it.
Right.
Oh, I just read an amazing suspense thriller. Actually, it was called "I Have Some Questions for You" by let me just see what her name is.
Yeah, that title sounds familiar.
She's literary. Rebecca Mackay.
Okay.
I have some questions for you. But it's beautifully written with a genre mystery, suspense, sensibility, you're finding out who killed whom, blah, blah, blah. And I loved it. I mean, I could not put it down.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, and I think probably how you were saying, romance writers can get kind of miscategorized or just have the kind of perception. But I think the thriller writers are the same way, because like you'll talk to somebody who's like, well, I'm writing a thriller, but it's a literary thriller. As I'm like, well, what the hell am I writing? Like, I'm imbuing, because I believe emotion should be at the heart of every story, and every page should be like, how is the character feeling? And I think, a lot of people just think of thrillers as like, the typical kind of CIA agent kind of a thing. And like, no, in fact, I write in a space where there's very few male writers, kind of that domestic suspense, because I'm just interested in family dynamics and writing from a female point of view. But a lot of people think like, oh, you must write like, a medical thriller or a business thriller. I'm like, no,
serial killers. Right?
Yeah, serial killers. And I'm like, there's nothing wrong with murderers, but what's interesting about it? Why are they doing it? What is their story? I don't want to just have this villain has zero depth to them at all. I want to understand who they are. And I want them to believe that what they're doing is right in their own twisted sense of morality. That's important to me. I love gray character. And your protagonist shouldn't be this hero. Your protagonist should have lots of flaws and should be human, just like the writer.
When I said I couldn't write a mystery, it was because I could not get myself in the head of someone who wanted to kill someone else without starting to figure out all the things that had to have gone wrong in their childhood and how incredibly messed up they were. And, mysteries or classic mysteries, the type I was trying, the guy's just supposed to like kill someone, basically.
Yeah. That's uninteresting to me.
No, it didn't work. It was just.
Yeah, because then you can't relate. And then, and because you kind of want a villain sometimes that people care about what happens to that person. And then they question themselves for having that feeling. That's the best kind of space you can get into. The Breaking Bad is a great example of that, of a protagonist that turns villainous that you still want to root for, but then you feel bad about doing that. I'm like, yes, that's good writing right there. And that's not easy to do.
Well, the same thing happens in romance. If you create an anti-hero in romance, you will get 17,000 letters saying it's time for him to fall in love. And that's it. Even if this person is, old or clearly gay, and I don't happen to write queer fiction, it doesn't matter. They're like, he needs love because they fall in love with him because he's an anti-hero.
That's amazing. Well, Mary, we're going to wrap up. Before we do, we're going to do our quick little storytelling bit of the show, the making it up portion. So I've picked 3 books kind of at random from my bookshelf. You're going to choose one of them, and we're going to pick a random sentence from a random page. I'm going to read that sentence. And after I read that sentence, we're going to embark on maybe a 2 or 3 minute long short story. So I'll read the sentence. You give me the next maybe sentence or 2. Then we'll alternate and we'll see where it goes. And it can go whatever direction we want to take it in. Speaking of mysteries, these are all kind of mystery titles. A World of Hurt by Mandy Mejia, which I think comes out in August. How to Solve Your Own Murder, which by Kristen Perrin, which I got at a conference, and I normally don't bring books home because it's just too much. And I fell in love with this cover, and it's a great book. And
is it fiction, or that's not a how to write mystery book?
No, it's an actual mystery book.
Title.
Yeah, I know. I do too.
Yeah, that's going to do well.
And Stuart Turton's The Last Murder at the End of the World.
Ooh.
So choose one of those 3 books.
Is The Last Murder at the End of the World, is that one sci-fi as well, like dystopia?
It's dystopian. Yeah.
Okay, let's go with the one you and I both like with the great cover.
Okay, How to Solve Your Own Murder. So give me a page between 1 and 350.
Okay, 157.
Okay. And I'm going to quickly scan it and see if I can find a sentence at the beginning. It's the beginning of a chapter. All right, I'm just going to read the sentence and you do whatever you want to with it. My eyes widened and my jaw set, but I kept my composure.
My eyes widened and my jaw set, but I kept my composure. Oh dear. Let's see. Let me just ask you a question you can cut out. But am I supposed to write in my own genre here, or
you can do whatever you want? You can take it wherever you want to go.
My eyes widened and my jaw set, but I kept my composure. He really should have kept his clothes on.
It would be easy to embarrass him. And part of me was fiercely tempted to do so just to show him who I was. But I decided to play this whole ritual out a few minutes longer just to see what he would do next.
Ladies, of course, never embarrass men, even when they've removed their kilt and are clearly trying to either pay them a lesson or embarrass them in some profound way. So I turned and called my aunt.
I started to walk away and I could hear his nervous voice behind me calling out, "What did you ring for her for?" I turned and said, "She always inspects the men I bring into my room."
We got a weird family setup here. I can see that the suspense and the romance.
I always lean towards like violence.
Lean towards violence. All right. So my Aunt Elizabeth was a woman who always judged men my Aunt Elizabeth was a woman who judged men against the many men of her past, and none of them ever lived up to my uncle. And I was quite certain, as she joined me in the doorway, that this hapless fellow would be at the bottom of the heap, naked or no.
She had several ways of making such a proclamation and judgment, but the surefire way was measured with a letter opener she carried in her left hand. the letter opener that had many hand notches on it where she could measure something. She looked at me and said, "Where is he?"
I said, "Aunt, you grow more vulgar by the moment, but I'm afraid this is all I have to offer." And may I say, he removed his kilt of his own accord. We both looked at the same direction.
All right, we'll call it there before it gets too graphic. That was great. I just love the idea that she's got a letter opener and it looks threatening, but she uses it as a ruler.
That's funny.
Yeah, that was good. That was a good exercise.
Right now. Well, it just worked in with what I'm writing because I'm writing a book right now where my heroine comes up on there's a laird naked in the stream fly fishing, and she's a virgin, right? So she looks at him and she's like, "Wow, this is not as scary as I'd heard, like he's nothing like those Greek vases." Of course, he has no idea the water's freezing. And so later, umpteen million chapters later, she's like, "What is that?" And he's like, "What do you mean? What is that?" And she's like, I didn't marry you. I didn't marry that." He's like, "Well,
that's amazing."
that." So our
Gotta have an opinion.
edged there.
Well, Mary, what a pleasure talking to you, and congratulations on your upcoming book, Viscount in Love, which I believe comes out September.
Nope, July 23rd.
July 23rd. I'm so sorry. Oh, so 2 weeks away. So that's very exciting. And I hope to get to meet you someday. You were fantastic to talk to. I really enjoyed this.
It was lovely. And please let me know when it comes out, okay? So I can put it, I've got a Facebook group.
Absolutely. My assistant, who is also my daughter, is in charge of such things, so she will notify you.
Wonderful. My assistant is also my editor, one of my editors.
Right.
So
it helps.
Daughters. Yeah, daughters are very useful. Okay.
Thanks, Mary. Enjoy Italy. Bye.
Bye.
So that's it. That is my conversation with Mary Bly / Eloisa James, writing as Eloisa James. So you can check out all of her information and read about her new book, Viscount in Love, at her website, which is eloisajames.com. She was fantastic. I really enjoyed the conversation with her. I felt like I learned a lot. And she just, I don't know, one of those guests where you just kind of click a little bit and you just feel like you have a rapport and just a fun, natural conversation. So that was a really good episode for me as well. Please check out my website, carterwilson.com. You can check out my books, subscribe to my newsletter, check out my appearances, or head on over to unboundwriter.com, where you can read more about my upcoming writing retreat in October, as well as my services for one-on-one writing coaching. And we will be launching online classes very soon, probably by the time that this episode airs. That's it for now. Thank you so much, as always, for watching and or listening to this episode of Making It Up. Another episode out just next week. In the meantime, happy reading.